No, Your Honor.
projected
As I
testimony?
was saying when you spoke, he felt it through the cloth in the nightstand. I was able to approximate the size and weight and make observations of that kind correlated to the weapon used in the offense. So for all those reasons, Your Honor, and in particular because of the extent to which Corliss makes it plain that temporal proximity is not required, or at least to the extent that we're talking about a matter of just weeks or months here, we're well within the time period contemplated by Corliss. In addition, the geographical proximity, which is something that the defendant raises in his submission, is not relevant here either. Natsuki, by coincidence, the observations were made of a weapon in California, just as was the situation here, Your Honor. And in Corliss, they also make the point that the geographical proximity is not relevant due to the easy mobility of firearms, Your Honor.
What statements are there? I've seen what you indicate Mr. Paradis is now going to testify, and the defense has indicated the previous statements that were made. Where is there something that specifically has Mr. Paradis testifying as to the specific size of what he felt or the weight of what he felt? As you indicated, he would be able to testify as to size and weight. Where in the notes of the interview?
He felt it through the cloth in the drawer, and it is our representation today that testimony will embrace observations as to size, shape, and weight.
And is there any reason that information has not previously been provided in the filings and as
to the
to...
extent that we're talking about someone who's feeling a firearm through a thin piece of cloth, it seems like a ready inference that the person doing so would have the ability to talk about, in general ways, about size and shape.
Well, but are you aware? I mean, has Mr. Paradis ever given a statement or made the Commonwealth aware of what size? Has he ever been asked what size it was he felt or what was the weight? There have been various statements as to what he has testified in the past or has said in the past, and the Commonwealth in its motion limine indicated what he would testify here. I don't see anything specifically with respect to size or weight. So I'm asking you, do you in fact know what he will say as to size and weight because you have obtained that information from him?
I do not stand here today, Your Honor. I know that he held the gun in his hands, stated that he had familiarity with firearms, was able to feel the gun through the cloth, and will make the observations that one might ordinarily make feeling an object through the cloth, as I say, Your Honor, related to size and shape.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I won't repeat what we've submitted in writing. This is the first we've heard that the witness is proposing to give yet another version in which he can supposedly testify about weight or size of the gun for the reasons of the temporal distance, the physical distance, and the several contradictions on substantive matters. I'd ask the court to exclude it, or at least in the alternative, have a voir dire before the witness is allowed to testify and prohibit the Commonwealth from discussing this in its opening statement.
I am not going to rule on this motion prior to the opening. I will preclude the Commonwealth from referencing it in the opening. I think it is clear, given the pieces of information that come out, which is different from time to time as to what Mr. Paradis said or saw or did, that I would like to be able to hear from him, hear what his projected testimony is, and at that time I will rule. The fact that I am requiring a voir dire of Mr. Paradis does not mean that I have ruled that the other that the court is inclined in the exercise of its discretion to allow him to testify, but I will defer ruling until any ruling on this matter until after he has testified as part of a voir dire.
Your Honor, can I ask you just to consider, there was two parts of that motion. One is obviously his statements, the defendant's statements that he had a .45 when he was in California, which is different than the separate occasion that you're referencing when there's a phone call made back to him to go into a drawer, take out an item that's wrapped in a T-shirt, and then his description of that. That's a separate
45
matter.
refers to the 45 in California.
Yes. Your
Right.
Honor.
I'm reserving on the issue entirely as to whether there can be any reference to that 45. As I indicated, the fact that I'm going forward with the voir dire of Mr. Paradise does not mean that I am ruling that a statement made in California after the defendant left without the firearm is admissible. But I will hear further argument on that issue after Mr. Paradise has testified.
Thank you.
And with respect to all of the other motions, parties are all in agreement that there are several motions pending, that there'll be no reference in opening, and including there were various motions. I don't see a follow-up to any of them on the other text messages and other statements between persons where you're going to provide counsel as to what those were, and nothing was ever then filed in court. So I'm assuming that anything that is the subject of a motion in limine will not be mentioned in the opening.
That's our assumption as well, Your Honor, yes.
And we can deal with it at 4 o'clock.
Yes, and Your Honor, the only text messages have been provided, and I've been shown the ones that are anticipated in the opening.
Okay, so you've seen the ones that they anticipate using the opening, there's no objection to those?
The ones they showed us, that's correct.
Yes, okay. And we will see how many of the other ones we can deal with at 4 o'clock today. I think that we can bring the juries back for both. I don't want to split up, obviously, your openings, and they can have, proceed to a lunch break after the openings. Thank you. We can bring the juries back. Do you need a?
Can we take a 3-minute break, Your Honor, for a bathroom
Sure.
break?
Sure. Why don't you say 1:45 on this clock?
Thank you very much.
All right. Seated.
The lawyers have a chance now to make opening statements, which you should think of as something like a roadmap or a guidebook to describe to you the evidence that they expect we'll be seeing and hearing during the course of the trial. Remember this, the lawyers weren't there. The lawyers do not know what went on. The lawyers marshal the evidence, but they do not testify. So nothing the lawyers say is evidence. It's to reinforce that point that I don't hand out the notebooks until after the opening statements. Mr. McCauley, do you wish to make an opening? Yes. Mr. Barber.
Ladies and gentlemen, on June 16th of 2013, at just after 9 p.m., the defendant was leaving his home in North Attleboro with his fiancée, Shayana Jenkins. He texted Odin Lloyd. He told Odin Lloyd that he, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, was going to come up to his house that night. And he, the defendant, and Miss Jenkins went to dinner and were out. As the defendant left the house, he also texted two of his friends who were then in Connecticut, Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, and he secured their attendance to his house in North Attleboro. That night after dinner, the defendant returned to his house, and after midnight, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, Ernest Wallace, and Carlos Ortiz were at the defendant's house in North Attleboro. They prepared themselves to pick up Odin Lloyd. With the defendant driving the vehicle, the three of them picked up Odin Lloyd outside of his house in Boston after 2:30 in the morning on Monday, June 17th. With the defendant driving, they drove to a secluded, isolated area in North Attleboro, a town where Odin Lloyd knew no one but the defendant and the defendant's fiancée, Shayana Jenkins. There, Odin Lloyd was shot 6 times. He was killed, and he was left in a secluded area. And when the defendant and Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace left from that spot, when they left Odin Lloyd there, they left evidence at the scene. They took evidence with them. They created evidence of their cooperative effort, and they tried to, and in some cases were successful in destroying evidence. In the course of this trial, ladies and gentlemen, the Commonwealth is going to prove to you that the defendant committed the crime of possession of a firearm, he committed the crime of possessing ammunition, and he committed the crime of murder. Ladies and gentlemen, Odin Lloyd, at the time of his death in June of 2013, was 27 years old. This is a photo of Mr. Lloyd. He was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He moved to the city of Boston with his family at the age of 3.5 years old. He lived at the time of his death in the Dorchester section of the city of Boston with his mother and his 2 sisters. He graduated from high school in Boston. He played football, and he was on the track and field team. When he graduated from college, or from high school, there was no money from college, so he entered into the workforce, but he continued to play football in the league in the city of Boston. At the time of his death, Odin Lloyd was working for a fertilizer company, a lawn fertilizer company in Norwood. He was a very reliable employee, and he would get from his home in Dorchester to his job by taking a bus and then riding his bike to the business. Prior to his working there at the fertilizer company, he had worked for an electrical contractor, and that work brought him to the state of Connecticut at the end of 2011 into the beginning of 2012. He stayed at a Comfort Suites hotel there when he was working in Connecticut, and there he met Shania Jenkins, the younger sister of the defendant's fiancée, Shayana Jenkins. They began dating in March of 2012. That's what the evidence will be that you hear, ladies and gentlemen. From 2012 to the time of Mr. Lloyd's death in 2013, the relationship between Odin Lloyd and Shania Jenkins progressed. They spoke pretty much every day. Shania would call Odin while she herself was on her way to work. When they first met, Shania was working at the hotel, either on the 3 to 11 shift or the 11 to 7 shift, and she was attending college. By the time of Mr. Lloyd's death in June of 2013, Miss Jenkins, Shania Jenkins, she graduated from college. She was accepted at law school in the city of Boston, and she was planning to move to the Boston area, get an apartment, get a job, and be with little boy. Now, as Shania Jenkins and Odin Lloyd's relationship progressed, Shania would come up to Boston to visit with Odin and his family, and Odin would go down to Connecticut to visit with Shania. When Shania came up to Boston, she would stay at her sister Shania's house. In the course of this trial, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear evidence that Shania Jenkins, the younger sister of Shayana Jenkins, and the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, grew up in the area of Bristol, Connecticut. Shayana Jenkins and the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, dated in high school. The defendant left college to begin playing professional football. And when he did that, Shayana Jenkins and he were together, and in November of 2012, they had a child together. When they had the child, they bought a home in North Alabama. And they moved in. That's, gentlemen, between the time they bought that house and the time Odin Lloyd was killed, that's where he would visit if Shania was at her sister's house. In doing that, you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, as it got close to June of 2013, that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, invited Odin Lloyd into his basement to smoke marijuana with him. And in doing that, the defendant gave them money to Odin Lloyd to purchase marijuana on his behalf and roll it into joints. That was the nature of their relationship in June of 2013. The house that they bought, ladies and gentlemen, was 22 Ronald C. Meyer Drive in the town of North Attleboro, and when they bought it, it came with a home surveillance system. After the defendant and Shayana bought the house, they upgraded the home surveillance system. They contacted the contractor that had done the initial installation, and they added multiple cameras as well as a digital video recorder. All told, in June of 2013, there were 12 cameras located on the inside and the outside of the house at 22 Ronald C. Meyer Drive. Some of them, because of the manner in which they had been upgraded, were now digital cameras. Some of them were older versions, and they were analog cameras, and they all wrote to the same digital video recorder. Because of the way they were installed, camera times weren't all the same, and they weren't all accurate. In the course of this trial, you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, how all the cameras have been synced to the world clock so that they're all operating on the same time, notwithstanding the time that's imprinted on the video camera from the actual system itself. They've been synced, as well as other video surveillance evidence that you will hear. All of it's been synced to the world clock, so there's a standard time. You'll also hear, ladies and gentlemen, how the digital video recorder, because so much sometimes information is being written to the hard drive, will drop frames. And on the digital cameras themselves, it creates an unusual sort of stop action. And you get a chance to hear about that and see it for yourself. In the course of this trial, you'll also hear about other people connected to the defendant. You'll hear the defendant's cousin's name, Tanya. She lived in Bristol, Connecticut at the time this occurred. You'll hear about Ernest Wallace. Ernest Wallace goes by the name of Bo, or also also as he was referred to by the defendant as Fish. Ernest Wallace appeared in the defendant's phone under the contact Fish 2, Fish with the number 2. You'll hear that from February of 2013 through the time of Odin Lloyd's death, Ernest Wallace was referred to as the defendant's right-hand man. He did things for the defendant, and in exchange, the defendant gave him, among other things, rental cars to use. One of those rental cars was a Nissan Altima. The Nissan Altima was rented from an Enterprise rent-a-car agency in the town of North Attleboro a week before Odin Lloyd was killed. He was driven by the defendant on June 17th to pick up Odin Lloyd. It was returned, even though it wasn't due, to the Enterprise rental car the very next day, or that same day, late in the afternoon on June 17th. You'll hear about Carlos Ortiz, known as Charlie Boy, or as he appeared in the defendant's contacts, C-Boy, who was a friend of the defendant's from Bristol. He'd grown up with the defendant years before, and he was unknown to Odin Lloyd. Odin Lloyd, who he had never met. You'll hear about a man by the name of Oscar Hernandez, who the defendant met through a mutual friend, and to whom, on April 11th of 2013, the defendant deposited $15,000 into a bank account, and in exchange, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear that the defendant received a gun. Now, with those players and that outline in mind, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear that in the time leading up to June 16th of 2013, the defendant and Odin Lloyd were texting back and forth. They were texting back and forth about the marijuana. And on June 14th, the defendant indicated to Mr. Lloyd that he was going to come and get him, and they were going back and forth about the defendant picking up the marijuana. On June 15th, in the early morning now, Saturday morning, the defendant arrived with his personal barber who picked up Mr. Lloyd at his home in Dorchester. They went to Rumor nightclub in the city of Boston. They got there late. It was almost closing time. Odin Lloyd had friends there as well. And during the course of that short time that all of these folks were in the club together, Odin and his friends were hanging out and having fun. The defendant appeared to them to be ignored. Although no words were exchanged at closing time, the defendant left the club angry. As he left Rumor nightclub, he went out onto Warrington Street, and his departure from the club was captured on video. You'll see the defendant walk in front of the car, the sweatshirt and the hat. He's yelling back to this man who just comes in between the car. That's his barber. He's telling the barber to stay there. He's going to get the car. The car was a black Suburban, Chevy Suburban, that had been rented on the same day as the Nissan Altima in the same Enterprise rent-a-car in North Attleboro. The only thing is, the defendant did go and get the car. He didn't come back. Instead, he was observed by a valet at the W Hotel just around the corner, in front of which black Chevy Suburban was parked, to be fixing a gun in his waistband and covering it with his shirt. The defendant returned to the corner, which you saw there on the video. And as he came back, within very few minutes, a crowd sort of formed. People were trying to take his photograph. Odin Lloyd and the barber came without Odin Lloyd's friends, and ultimately nothing happened there at the corner. They went back to the Chevy Suburban. And we sat in the Chevy Suburban, two young women, one of whom was the defendant's babysitter at his home in North Attleboro, came by. They were walking themselves from a different club to their car that was parked a few blocks away. The defendant told them to get into the car, to give him a ride to where their car was parked. They did. The defendant didn't go there. Instead, the two young women, Mr. Lloyd and the barber, with the defendant driving the Suburban, actually leave the city of Boston. They return to North Attleboro. They drop the barber off at his car outside of the defendant's house. And then, while the defendant is telling the young women it's going to be okay, he drove them to an apartment in the town of Franklin, an apartment that the defendant maintained. Ultimately, you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, the two young women had to call for a car service early in the morning of June 15th in order to get back to their car in the city of Boston. The defendant himself was supposed to be at breakfast with his mother and his family, and he was not. As a result, his fiancée, Shayana Jenkins, set about to find him. She called her own sister, who then in turn contacted Old Lloyd in order to get in touch with the defendant. The defendant then sent Shayana Jenkins a text using Odin Lloyd's phone. And you'll see there, ladies and gentlemen, the text recovered from Mr. Lloyd's phone, the defendant indicating that he had made a mistake, he had messed up, he was on his way home. The defendant that morning, Mr. Lloyd, returned to North Attleboro with the defendant driving the Suburban. The defendant gave keys to the Suburban to Lloyd on that Saturday morning, June 15th, and told him, go ahead and return the car on Monday, so that Odin Lloyd would have a way to get back to the city of Boston, and the defendant went out with his family. But that afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant began rounding up his friends. He sent a text to Ernest Wallace, asking Ernest Wallace what time Ernest Wallace, his ninja, would return to North Attleboro at 3:15 in the afternoon. From that time to the evening of June 16th, as I indicated, the defendant texted and called Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz more than 40 times, from the morning of June 15th to June 16th. And on June 16th, the defendant sent those texts to first at 9:05, I'm coming to grab that tonight. That's Aaron Hernandez on the left side, and Odin Lloyd's response in the center. And after Mr. Lloyd agrees that and there's then, I'll figure it out and hit you up. There's no further communication from Aaron Hernandez's phone to Odin Lloyd's phone. But after those text messages, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant texts his friend Carlos Ortiz. He's imploring them to come up. And after those texts, there's also no further communication between Aaron Hernandez's phone and Ernest Wallace or Carlos Ortiz's phone. The defendant switches over to using Shayana Jenkins' phone. And from Shayana Jenkins' phone to Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, the defendant continues to maintain contact with them and continues to be apprised of how and where they are. And as you saw, ladies and gentlemen, those texts between Odin Lloyd and Aaron Hernandez, they don't come from Aaron Hernandez's phone. Aaron Hernandez's phone is later recovered. Those texts are deleted. Those texts that you saw come from Odin Lloyd's phone. You'll see, ladies and gentlemen, On the video surveillance, Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace arrived at the home from North Attleboro after midnight. They alert the defendant. You'll have phone records that show that, and you'll see on the video the use of the phone. They're let into the house by the very babysitter the defendant had picked up and driven to Frank. Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz arrived at the house and go down into the basement. As I told you, there are a number of cameras. The cameras in the basement that night weren't recorded. We go down to the basement and they wait there for approximately 20 minutes or so, maintaining contact with the defendant. You'll be able to see on the video surveillance itself that they know the defendant's arriving. They come up from the basement and start looking for the defendant even before he pulls in. The defendant pulls in driving Shayana Jenkins' vehicle. He jumps out as the vehicle barely comes to a stop. He leaves the door open. He greets his friends in the driveway. You'll see, ladies and gentlemen, as they enter into the house, the defendant is carrying the gun. The defendant, Aaron Hernandez, Ernest Wallace, and Carlos Ortiz go down into the basement. They're there for approximately 15 minutes. After about 15 minutes, they come up and they begin to make preparation in the car. It takes approximately 7 more minutes back and forth into the house, into the basement, carrying things out to the car, in the trunk, before they finally leave. They leave after 1 a.m. And you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, that a few days after the murder, the defendant makes a statement saying that he hoped the time of the murder or the homicide of Odin Lloyd would come out because he was at a bar at the time, or at a club at the time it happened. And that's not the case, ladies and gentlemen, because the defendant had been to a bar, the South Street Cafe in Providence, where he met with other folks, where he had dinner with Shayana Jenkins, and then he returned to his house. He left after 1 a.m. in the morning, and you'll hear and you'll have a chance to see from cell phone records, receipts, video surveillance, and other corroboration, including driving the route at the same time under same conditions by detectives 2 weeks later, that the defendant in the path that they take from the house to pick up Odin Lloyd and then ultimately return. What you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, is that when they leave just after 1 o'clock in a rented Nissan Altima, Ernest Wallace is initially driving. They get out to Route 95. They don't head to Boston, where Odin Lloyd is. They head south along Route 95. And at that point, they use Ernest Wallace's phone to contact Odin Lloyd. In total, from the time they leave, 5 telephone calls are placed from Ernest Wallace's phone to Odin Lloyd, who's in the city of Boston, at his house. The first one, Wallace's phone, connects with the cell phone tower right on the Rhode Island, Massachusetts line next to Route 95, South Attleboro. After that, they turn north. They use the phone again. It connects in the vicinity of Foxborough. They then drive up Route 95 and make the right, heading towards Braintree to 93 Southeast Expressway. They get off at the first exit, Route 138, and they stop at Blue Hill Express, a gas station. It's approximately now 2:03 in the morning. They stay there for 10 minutes. When they arrive into the gas station, Ernest Wallace is the driver of the Nissan Altima. Aaron Hernandez is. Aaron Hernandez is the driver. Ernest Wallace is in the front passenger seat. Carlos Ortiz is seated behind the defendant. And you'll see Carlos Ortiz has a towel around his neck. You'll also get a chance to see on this home video surveillance that when Wallace and Ortiz had arrived, that towel had been in Ernest Wallace's lap. It's now around Carlos Ortiz's neck. They stayed there for approximately 10 minutes. It's all captured on video. You'll get a chance to see that. Leave again with Aaron Hernandez driving. They leave from the parking or the pump area and head back towards Route 128, and again back towards Braintree. You can see the way the car is going. It's also corroborated by the phone records because 3 more telephone calls are placed to Odin Lloyd from Ernest Wallace's cell phone. They show the vehicle heading up on the Southeast Expressway near the area of Melnia Cass Boulevard, and then ultimately the last telephone call at 3:22 a.m. hits off of a tower that covers the approach to Odin Lloyd Street, Basin Street, in the city of Boston, Dorchester section. Basin Street is a one-way street. The tower shows a 322 telephone call, and then you'll see, ladies and gentlemen, Odin Lloyd lived at number 10. Across the street at number 9 was a neighbor who had video surveillance outside us. It shows the Nissan Altima approaching and Odin Lloyd getting into it. The time is there. It's approximately 2:33 in the morning. Odin Lloyd's sister was sitting in a car just down the street and saw the whole thing happen. The defendant had told Odin that they were going to step out and that he would figure out what was going on. At 2:33 in the morning, ladies and gentlemen, there are no bars, there are no clubs open in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Video surveillance, cell phone data, toll records show path is then taken. Because even though now Wallace's phone is no longer used and Ortiz's phone isn't being used and the defendant isn't using his phone, Odin Lloyd's phone maintains connection with the cell phone network. And between cameras located at streets, video surveillance of businesses, Odin Lloyd's cell phone records, and toll records, you'll be able to see the route, ladies and gentlemen. They leave from picking up Odin Lloyd on Basin Street and make a right. They head back towards Route 93, then turn north a short distance onto the Massachusetts Turnpike, heading west, all the way out towards Route 128 and Route 95. At the Weston toll booth at 2:53 in the morning, the Nissan Altima, rented by the defendant Aaron Hernandez, proceeds through the toll without paying. It's captured by photograph. From there, the cell phone information and then video surveillance shows south onto North Attleboro. Coming off of the exit, it's a right and then a quick right into the North Attleboro Industrial Park, known as John Beach Boulevard. There's surveillance at that location. There are very few cars on the road. There is Odin Lloyd's cell phone. It was 3:20 in the morning. That is the direction from there to the defendant's house. And you'll see, ladies and gentlemen, that just under 10 minutes later, the defendant arrives back at his house. He's still driving. Having picked up only three people returned to Aaron Hernandez's house. Aaron Hernandez, Ernest Wallace, and Carlos Ortiz. The defendant puts the code into three of them got quickly them to be quiet. Saying baby. The basement, moving around on the first floor. The defendant basement holding trial. You'll hear from a representative of law that appearance is unique. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a law. Now, you also hear that the defendant is scheduled to be at his work in the morning, June 17th. Ode is scheduled to be at his work on the morning of June 17th at 7 o'clock. Neither of them appear. Instead, in the course of the trial, you'll have a chance to take a look at the surveillance video of the house. You'll see that shortly after the defendant is seen with the Glock, the cameras, the digital cameras, are shut down in the house. They're not turned on until the afternoon of June 17th. And sometime after 1:30, approximately 1:44, so the defendant wakes up Wallace and Ortiz, who are down in his basement. They play with his baby. You'll see the defendant leaves Carlos Ortiz while the defendant himself goes back to the Nissan Altima and retrieves evidence, a magazine clip or a firearm. You see, ladies and gentlemen, that the defendant, Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace, leave from the house in the Nissan Altima just before 5 p.m. for a firearm. You take the Nissan Altima, ladies and gentlemen, that the defendant, Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace, leave from the house in the Nissan Altima just before 5 p.m. on June 17th. You take the Nissan Altima to the Enterprise rent-a-car. The defendant says to the manager there that he's returning it because the car has been cracked up. It's not due back. She asks the defendant, the manager asks the defendant, how did it happen? The defendant says that he didn't know. He doesn't crack up cars. Somebody cracked it up, and that's why he's returning it. They get in exchange a Chrysler sedan, and they return back to the defendant's house in North Attleboro. That time, or the time before they leave, there are no items being taken out of that basement being put into the car. You'll have a chance to see that on the video. Sometime shortly after 5:15 p.m., Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz leave from the defendant's house. Their cell phone records show they actually go to Franklin, Massachusetts. Just shortly after, 15 minutes later, Matt Kent, a young high school student, was running through the area of Corliss Landing. As he actually lived in the same neighborhood as the defendant. He had been taken to a gym in the southern part of the North Attleboro Industrial Park. He was dropped off so he could work out. He was running home, coming through Corliss Landing as part of his workout. As he did that, he saw off in the distance the body of what turned out to be Odin Lloyd. He could immediately detect there were no signs of life. And he, being a young man, went and got adult help. When the adult help returned, they also saw that there were no signs of life. They all went. And what you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, is that an investigation then ensues. As I told you, at 3:20 in the morning, the defendant turns north, heading on John Beach Boulevard. What you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, towards the defendant's home on John Beach Boulevard, as you get towards Metalore, a metal refining business, the road takes a sharp right-hand turn. Metalore, on the early morning of June 17th, had 2 video surveillance cameras that showed the area of that sharp right-hand turn. If you make that sharp right-hand turn, you continue on to the defendant's house. If you go straight, you go into Forest Landing. That video surveillance shows that at 3:23 in the morning, consistent with the car entering the North Attleboro Industrial Park at 3:20 in the morning, a car traveling north doesn't make the turn. It goes into Forest Landing. After you pass a building, that road turns into a gravel road and it opens up into a secluded area. It was sort of a pit where they dumped construction waste and there was sand, there were trees off in the distance, there was no light. That's where Odin Lloyd was found. The video surveillance shows the car going in, it's about 100 yards to where Odin Lloyd was found, and then coming out 3 minutes and 20 seconds later. When the police respond now after 5:30 p.m. on June 17th, there's actually a heavy thunderstorm rolling in. They see Odin Lloyd. They have to quickly identify items of evidence, either pick it up or cover it. They find 5 shell casings, and all of them are collected. One to the left of Odin Lloyd's foot, another off to his right, 2 in that little ditch, 2 in that little area to his left, right, and then 1 above his head, all to the right side of that photograph. They collected Odin Lloyd's baseball hat. They collect a towel that was located at the scene. They find a footwear impression, and they cover it up. And they find a tire impression, and they cover it up. And they find a joint, a marijuana cigarette, to Odin Lloyd's right. That joint is later analyzed and is determined to have Odin Lloyd's DNA and the defendant's DNA. You'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, that by examining video surveillance of the defendant, Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, police are able to determine the make and the model of their footwear that they wore that night. We're able to determine ultimately the size that each of them wears. And you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, that on the morning of June 17th, the defendant was wearing a pair of Air Jordan Retro 11 low basketball shoes. They had only been out in the marketplace for a short period of time. Carlos Ortiz was wearing different shoes. Ernest Wallace was also wearing different shoes. All of the shoes, ladies and gentlemen, were ultimately compared to the single footwear impression that was determined to be there before the body was recovered, and the defendant's footwear impression, ladies and gentlemen, was consistent with the footwear impression that was left at the scene. You'll hear that the tire impression was examined. It was determined to have been made by the rear wheel of the Nissan Altima. As I told you, ladies and gentlemen, there was evidence left there, 5 .45 caliber shell casings, and there was evidence taken with them. One piece of evidence was a shell casing. On June 18th, in the morning, the manager at the Enterprise Rent-A-Car cleaned out the vehicle. Inside, underneath the driver's seat, she found a shell casing. She did not know the significance of it at the time. and she threw it with some other items into a dumpster there. That shell casing was later recovered. It too was analyzed. It's a 45 shell casing. It too was swabbed for DNA. The DNA on the shell casing is consistent with the defendant's. You'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, that each of those shell casings were also analyzed microscopically. They were all determined to have been fired by the same firearm. And the markings on them are unique. They are consistent with having been fired by a Glock 45. Olin Lloyd himself was autopsied. Determined he had 6 gunshot wounds. 1 in his right forearm, 1 in his right flank, 2 in his back, shot as if he was crouching down. 2 projectiles were recovered from his body. Olin Lloyd had 2 gunshot wounds to his chest. They went through him as he laid on the ground at Corliss Landing. The ground beneath Olin Lloyd was dug up and 2 more projectiles were found. All of them 45 caliber. 4 projectiles in total. Some of them had sufficient markings to allow them to be compared microscopically to determine they were fired from the same weapon. And again, it was a Glock 45. Ladies and gentlemen, when the police uncovered Olin Lloyd's body there at the scene, he had on him his own wallet and ID, $64+ on his person, his cell phone, on which you've seen the text messages, his own keys, and the Enterprise rent-a-car key. The Enterprise rent-a-car key was the key to the black Chevy Suburban. The black Chevy Suburban was not located anywhere there at Corliss Lane. The police took the key. They called an Enterprise rent-a-car office that was open. And they learned that that key belonged to the black Chevy Suburban and that it had been rented by the defendant. So on June 17th, after Mr. Lloyd's body was found, 2 detectives went to Dorchester to meet and inform Olin Lloyd's family that Olin had been found, and 2 detectives went to the defendant's house. They arrived at the defendant's house at approximately 9:45 in the evening. They knocked on the door and rang the bell. They could see inside, and they could see that a television was on and that there were lights on and items around the first floor. But they got no response. They tried again. They got no response. They went around the house looking for signs of light or for signs of a forced entry. There was no black Chevy Suburban there. They got no response. They went to a neighbor who worked with the defendant and spoke there. Ultimately, they go back and sit outside the defendant's house at Ronald C. Meyer Drive. About 45 minutes after her arrival, the defendant came out and spoke with the officers. They had been unaware that they were being seen on home surveillance. The defendant told the officers he'd been watching. He told the officers that he had seen O, who the name he used to refer to Olin Lloyd as, the day before, up Olin's way. Later, the police spoke to Shayana Jenkins. It was about 11:20 p.m. During the course of their conversation, the defendant was texting and phoning Shayana Jenkins. And Shayana Jenkins left from speaking with the detectives. You'll hear she then called Ernest Wallace. The defendant himself had been calling Ernest Wallace that night, June 17th, shortly after the arrival of the police. The defendant stayed in contact with Wallace. Shayana Jenkins stayed in contact with Wallace and Ortiz. And Shayana Jenkins, in fact, drove from North Attleboro to Franklin, and then later that night, she drove to Coventry, Rhode Island, where she met with Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz. Phone records will show that. And Shayana Jenkins, ladies and gentlemen, withdrew money from an ATM account. Having now, ladies and gentlemen, orchestrated the killing of Odin Lloyd, we'll hear the defendant orchestrates cover-up. Ortiz and Wallace fled after meeting with Shayana Jenkins back to Bristol, Connecticut, to the defendant's cousin's house. You'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, that the following day, June 18th, we'll start that. That morning now, June 17th into June 18th, after the police speak to Shayana Jenkins at 11:20, she then goes down and meets in Coventry, Rhode Island. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, a Massachusetts State Police detective called Shania Jenkins. That detective is the first person to inform Shania Jenkins of the death of Odin Lloyd.
Can I ask you to start wrapping up, please?
Yes, Your Honor. You're here, ladies and gentlemen, that after Odin Lloyd was found, the defendant was involved in conversations with people like Shania Jenkins and others that he knew. He told them various things. He said he wasn't present at the homicide. He said he had no involvement. He'd been out with Lloyd, and then when he left the club, he had given Odin Lloyd the key. He swore on his baby. He said he was elsewhere at a club when the killing happened. That's not what the evidence will show. The evidence will show that on June 15th, the defendant was unhappy with the victim. He'd given Odin Lloyd information about himself. The defendant then called up his friends. He set up a meeting with Odin Lloyd. He took steps to conceal his own role by using the phones of others. He drove for more than 2 hours, the only purpose for which was to get the victim into the secluded area. He orchestrated, participated in the killing, he covered up the killing. He secured the flight of his joint ventures. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll see on June 17th, just after 6:15, the basis of all the evidence, the basis of the evidence that's going to be introduced in this trial, at the end of this case, the best you find.
Spence, wish to make a motion.
We do, Your Honor.
Aaron Hernandez is an innocent man. The evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend Odin Lloyd, nor did he Hernandez is not guilty. Ask or orchestrate. We are here to murder him because the police and the prosecutors targeted Aaron from the very beginning. As soon as they found out that Aaron Hernandez, the celebrity football player, the New England Patriot, was a friend of Odin Lloyd's, Aaron never had a chance. It was over. They set out on an investigation, ladies and gentlemen, collected evidence in order to support the story they just told you, even when the evidence they collected should have led them in another direction. They locked on Aaron, and they targeted him, even when they developed evidence that two other men, who, unlike Aaron, were not friends with Odin, were with Aaron and Odin that night. The evidence will show the investigation was sloppy, and unprofessional. What about the facts that showed Aaron's innocence? What happened to those when they were collected during the investigation? Well, the evidence will show they were ignored or they were twisted in order to fit the story they wanted to tell you today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you will learn through the evidence that this effort failed. The evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend, Odin Lloyd. Now, I'm not going to talk to you as long as the prosecutor did. We understand that we're about to start a long trial, and you're going to have to sit through it. And we thank you for that. We thank you for the vital service you are supplying your community. I'm not going to go through today point by point, blow by blow. We have faith in your ability to observe the evidence as it comes in, to regard the evidence, to evaluate it, to question it, and at the end of this process, render a fair verdict. We want to start this trial, and I suspect you do too. Now, you just heard quite a story, a dramatic story, an exciting story, maybe one that might be on TV. It's just a story, and it's not true. The evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend, Odin Lloyd. Now, sometimes, because the prosecution went first, sometimes people have a natural tendency to believe the first story they hear. And as the facts come out later, they might have a tendency to credit the facts that support that first story and disregard the facts that don't fit it. Don't do that here, ladies and gentlemen. Keep an open mind as the court has instructed you to do. That's your duty as jurors. If you reach conclusions today based on what you just heard, you're no better, no different than the police and the prosecutors who brought Aaron here in the first place. You're jurors. You have the ability to evaluate the evidence. You come with an open mind. Give us a chance to show you the truth. We start here from a clean slate. I ask you to flush from your mind any preconceived notion or preconceived judgment that you may have brought with you to the jury box. I ask you to rid yourself of all presumptions, except one, the presumption of innocence that lays on that man sitting at that table. Aaron Hernandez, as we sit here today, is an innocent man. And at the end of this process, that conclusion will remain the same. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you think about this story as you hear the evidence, you'll see that it makes no sense. It is not supported by the evidence you will see, hear, and if you want, touch in this trial. The evidence will show that Aaron had no intent, no reason to murder his friend, Odin Lloyd. So, as a result, the prosecution will try to dazzle and distract you. They will spend days pointing out the obvious to you. They will flood you with meaningless facts. Ladies and gentlemen, your job as jurors is to focus on the real evidence. Focus on the evidence that matters. They'll go on and on with evidence showing they can track a cell phone call, or analyze dirt, or sync to the world clock. But what evidence will they show you that Aaron Hernandez murdered his friend, Odin Lloyd? That's the key question you as jurors have to focus on. Don't be distracted. Don't be misled. Focus on the real issue. The evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez is an innocent man. Now, I would also caution you to be on the lookout for evidence the prosecution presents to you that is twisted, or the evidence they ignore, or when they only tell you part of the story. We're going to point those out to you, ladies and gentlemen. We will draw your attention to those situations. Let me give you a few examples. You heard the prosecutor say that Aaron and Wallace and Ortiz drove a rented Nissan Altima up to pick up Mr. Lloyd, Aaron's friend, on the early morning hours of June 17th. A rented Nissan Altima. Sounds suspicious. The evidence will show. What they didn't tell you is that Aaron was always renting cars. The evidence will show that from March 2012 until June 2013, Aaron Hernandez rented over 24 cars, 25 from Enterprise Rental Car alone. 5 of those cars were Nissan Altimas. Ladies and gentlemen, the use of a rental car, in this case, was not part of a murder plot. It was part of Aaron's everyday existence. Sometimes Aaron loaned those rental cars to his friends. He loaned a rented black Chevrolet Suburban to his friend Odin Lloyd. He loaned a rented Nissan Altima to his friend Ernest Wallace. Here's another example. You've heard references now to videotape and seen snippets of videotape taken from Aaron's own home surveillance system. The prosecution maintains that they have photographs and video images from that system that show Aaron with a gun in his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll decide in the various scenes that we will show when the evidence really comes in, what's in Aaron's hand. Whether it's an iPod or an iPhone or an iPad or a BlackBerry or TV remotes or a gun or something else. And if you think it's a gun, what kind of gun is it? If you think it's a gun, does the video tell you that it belongs to Aaron Hernandez? Here's another example. That video system, what the prosecution didn't tell you in full was that Aaron Hernandez was the party who initiated the upgrading and installation of that video system. He was trained not only in the operation of the cameras, but also on how to disable the system, stop it from recording. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that the video that is used by the prosecution was recorded on Aaron's own home surveillance system. And he was fully capable, fully aware of how to stop it from recording at any time. But he did not. Here's another point about that video system. Obviously, it has now become the centerpiece of the Commonwealth's case. That video system in Aaron's home. What they didn't tell you is that that video system was in Aaron's possession from shortly after 3:30 in the morning on Monday, June 17th, throughout that entire day. No police, no one else in his home, Aaron, and access to his video system. The one he installed, the one he was trained on. At around 11 p.m. Monday night, Aaron went to the North Attleboro Police Station voluntarily. When he returned, again, he was in his home with his home surveillance system for another entire day. Ladies and gentlemen, destruction of evidence. The evidence will show that if Aaron Hernandez wanted to destroy the recordings on that video system, he could have, but he did not, because he had no reason to. Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend, Odin Lloyd. Let me tell you a little bit about Aaron. The prosecution didn't tell you much. Let me tell you a little bit about Aaron. Aaron's from Bristol, Connecticut. It's an old New England city in the center of the state of Connecticut. Aaron grew up there. Bristol has some tough parts. It has some tough people. It's the kind of place where the people don't always trust the police and they don't tell on each other. Aaron attended Bristol Central High School. It was at Bristol Central High School that he met Cheyenne Jenkins. Over the years, off and on, Cheyenne and Aaron dated. Eventually, many years later, Aaron and Cheyenne moved in together. In November 2012, on Aaron's 23rd birthday, they had a daughter, ABL. Now, Aaron came out of Bristol High School as one of the best high school football players in the history of that state. As a result, he received a full football scholarship to the University of Florida. At the University of Florida, Aaron helped the Florida Gators win a national football championship in 2009. That same year, Aaron Hernandez was voted a first-team All-American football player. He was also chosen as the best tight end in all of college football. Aaron Hernandez played football with passion and with joy. As a result of his efforts in Florida, Aaron received a pro contract to play for an NFL team, our hometown team, the New England Patriots. Aaron signed that contract with the Patriots in 2010. As a result of Aaron's contributions and others, Aaron helped lead the Patriots to the Super Bowl in the 2011 season. Aaron was generous with his friends. Aaron gave them money. Aaron entertained them. Aaron gave them game tickets. Aaron took them on trips. Aaron paid for hotels. Aaron let them use rental cars. Aaron let friends stay at the apartment he rented in Franklin, Massachusetts. Aaron opened up his own home and let friends stay in his home. Now, Odin Lloyd was one of Aaron's friends. You see, Aaron had met Odin around the summer of 2012, because Odin Lloyd had been dating Cheyenne Jenkins' sister, Shania. Shania was ABL's aunt. Odin and Shania were frequent guests at Aaron's home. They attended family event at Cheyenne's birthday party. Odin Lloyd stayed over Aaron's house several times. Odin Lloyd was Aaron's friend. Ernest Wallace was from Bristol. Ernest had been a longtime Hernandez family friend for many years. The evidence will show that Aaron and Ernest were close. Aaron and Wallace went out together. The evidence will show that Wallace in Aaron's home, in the finished basement of Aaron's home in North Attleboro. You will have an opportunity to see that there. Wallace also stayed in the rented apartment that Aaron had in Franklin, Massachusetts. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that Aaron and Wallace frequently went on trips together. They went out on the town together. When Aaron went to nightclubs, Wallace was frequently at his side. The evidence will also show that when they weren't together, Aaron and Wallace communicated by phone and text frequently. Carlos Ortiz was also from Bristol. Carlos had grew up in the housing projects in Bristol. Aaron knew Carlos, and Carlos used to hang around with Aaron's extended family in Bristol. The evidence will show that while Aaron kept in touch with Carlos Ortiz, they were not particularly close. Now, Aaron and his friend Odin Lloyd had something else in common besides dating sisters: marijuana. Aaron smoked. Odin smoked marijuana. Aaron and his friend Odin smoked marijuana together. Listen very carefully to the evidence about who it was that gave Aaron the marijuana cigarettes or cigars called blunts. It was none other than his friend Odin Lloyd. Odin Lloyd would obtain marijuana and roll blunts for Aaron, especially for Aaron. Odin was known as the blunt master. Now, ladies and gentlemen, much will be said about June 2013. Let's talk about that for a little bit. In June 2013, Aaron Hernandez was in his off-season from the New England Patriots. The off-season. As a result, Aaron was enjoying life to the fullest. Aaron had a lifestyle. That lifestyle may not be like yours or like mine. In fact, it may not be a lifestyle that you approve of. But it was a lifestyle not unusual for an unmarried, 23-year-old star professional athlete. In June of 2013, the evidence will show Aaron liked to go out on the town. He liked to listen to hip-hop music. He liked to drink. He liked to smoke marijuana. He liked to go to nightclubs with his friends. And one of those friends was his friend, Odin Lloyd. Let's talk in specifics about what the evidence will show about that weekend in June. June 14th through Monday, June 17th. The evidence will show that on Friday, June 14th, Aaron and his friend Odin went out to a nightclub. They were joined by one of Aaron's other friends, his barber, Hernandez. Drove to Odin's house in Dorchester in a rented black Chevy Suburban. They picked Odin up, and then Aaron, his friend Odin, and his friend Robbie went to Club Rumor in Boston. The evidence will show this was not the first time Aaron went to Aaron's rented apartment in Franklin, Massachusetts with two young women. They partied all night and into the morning hours with these two young women. You see, part of that lifestyle I mentioned, part of that lifestyle for single men with some money to spend, Aaron and his friends would go out on the town, and they were always looking to hook up with women. Aaron wanted to do that. The evidence will show Odin wanted to do that as well. So they spent the night together in that apartment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd ask you to listen very, very carefully to the descriptions of that evening, that night, given by Robbie Alaveras and the two young women that were with Aaron and Odin right up through the early morning hours. Listen to how they were treated by the police. Listen to what happened to them when they gave their eyewitness accounts and provided facts when they were interviewed by the police. Just not the facts the police wanted. Not the facts that lined up with the story you just heard. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that these three private citizens, when they didn't give the police the story the police wanted, lied to and harassed. Keep your eyes open for other examples of how witnesses who didn't give the police the information they wanted on Aaron were treated. Look what happened to them. Now, on Saturday morning, Aaron woke up in his Franklin apartment. He knew he was in trouble. Because you see, he had a pre-standing appointment. He was supposed to meet Cheyenne and his mother, Terry, who had driven up from Connecticut. So Aaron went home with Odin in the rented black Chevy Suburban. Aaron and his friend Odin arrived at the home in those mornings, in that early morning of Saturday, June 15th. Aaron apologized to Cheyenne and went out to breakfast as scheduled with Cheyenne and his mother Terry. Odin joined him briefly at the home. Aaron rented black Suburban to drive back to Boston. Now, for the rest of that Saturday, Aaron spent the day at home with Cheyenne and little baby APL. But the evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that as Saturday progressed, Aaron Hernandez, the young, unmarried, professional football player in his off-season, was itching to go out again with the guys. He started planning going out with the guys on Sunday night, just as he had gone out with the guys on Friday. Sunday dawned. Sunday, June 16th, Father's Day. Aaron began the day by texting numerous friends of his Happy Father's Day greetings. These were friends that he knew were also fathers. On Sunday, Cheyenne, ABL, and Aaron drove to Boston. They went to the zoo. They had a picnic in the park. That evening, they went out to dinner, a celebration of Father's Day. Aaron and Cheyenne and two other couples. They went to a restaurant in Providence called the South Street Cafe. And there, Aaron and Cheyenne and the other couples lingered for several hours, having food and having drinks. Fortunately, one of the women who was there snapped a cell phone picture of the group. It's on your screen right now. That's Aaron Hernandez, Sunday night, June 16th. You, ladies and gentlemen, are going to have to decide whether the smiling Aaron Hernandez, the friendly Aaron Hernandez, with those individuals at a bar and a restaurant in Providence, is the same Aaron Hernandez that was the subject of the story that you just heard. Now, I mentioned that as early as Saturday, Aaron was itching to go out again with the guys. He had texted Ernest Wallace and asked Ernest to go out with him. You see, as I mentioned before, Ernest frequently accompanied Aaron when he would go out to nightclubs. But Ernest Wallace wasn't around that weekend. Wallace had taken the rented Nissan Altima that Aaron had loaned him and driven back to Connecticut for a wedding. Aaron wanted to go out with Wallace. He texted him. He called him. He asked him when he was coming back. Wallace did come. Wallace came back after Aaron and Cheyenne returned from their night out with friends in Providence. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Wallace came to Aaron's house with Ortiz, who had tagged along when Wallace left Connecticut and came back up to Boston. The evidence will show that they came to go out with Aaron. Now, I mentioned that the evidence would show that Aaron wanted to go out with the guys. Well, one of the other guys, one of his other friends that he wanted to go out with, was his friend Odin Lloyd. He texted Odin. You'll see these texts. You'll see them all in full. And I would ask you to look at them in context and bring your common sense to what's going on. He texted Odin Lloyd and asked if he wanted to step out like he had on the previous evening. This is Odin Lloyd, his friend. This is Odin, who was listed in Aaron's phone as O. Odin listed Aaron in his phone using a term of friendship from street slang that was well familiar to Aaron and to Odin. Odin called Aaron "dis nigger." Aaron contacted his friend Odin Lloyd, and Odin Lloyd accepted the invitation to go out. Now listen very carefully to the evidence around that. The evidence will show that after Odin Lloyd accepted the invitation from Aaron to go out on the town, Odin started preparing for a late night. Witnesses will testify that as he waited for Aaron to come and pick him up, just as Aaron had picked him up on Friday night, Odin consumed 2 Red Bull energy drinks. The evidence will also show that as he waited for Aaron to come and pick him up, Odin made numerous phone calls, calling around, trying to see where the late night action was in Boston that night. The evidence will show, you see, that Odin had attended an after-hours party the night before. Well, the guys did go out. Aaron, Wallace, and Ortiz drove to Dorchester, just as Aaron and Robbie had driven to Dorchester on Friday night. They picked Odin up at his home and took off in the general direction of Aaron's home in North Attleboro. You're going to see that home. Aaron's home. The place where he had his man cave, he called it. That man cave had a pool table. It had a home theater. It had a place to smoke blunts. They were also headed in the direction of Aaron's apartment in Franklin, Massachusetts. The very apartment where Aaron and Odin had partied into the wee hours of the morning on Friday night. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Commonwealth, the prosecutors say that Aaron shot his friend Odin at Corliss Landing, or orchestrated him being shot. The evidence will show that Aaron did no such thing. They will show you video of all sorts of things. They will show you video of Aaron pumping gas. But there is no video of what happened at Corliss Landing. So, the prosecution will introduce evidence that will try to shock you. You've seen some already. They will show you crime scene photos, autopsy photos that will be upsetting. Ladies and gentlemen, those photos will show that Aaron's friend Odin Lloyd was killed that night. But they will tell you nothing about who killed Odin Lloyd or why. Why? That's another question you should focus on. Why? Why would Aaron Hernandez do this? Ladies and gentlemen, in June of 2013, Aaron Hernandez had the world at his feet. He had a long-term professional football contract. He had a beautiful home in North Attleboro that he had just settled into. He had a girlfriend with whom they had started talking about wedding plans. He was the father to a 7-month-old baby girl he adored. Why? Ladies and gentlemen, in June of 2013, Aaron Hernandez was planning a future, not a murder. Scrutinize the evidence. Look for evidence of why Aaron would do this. Sometimes that's called motive. What was his reason? What is the evidence of a reason? What is the evidence of a motive? Why would he kill his friend? Well, Does this make sense to me? Now it's your turn. Finally, you get a chance to look for evidence of a reason or a motive. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show there was no reason. There was no motive. Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend, Odin Lloyd. Now, there will be evidence that Aaron was with his friend Odin Lloyd shortly before he was killed. But there isn't evidence that Aaron killed his friend Odin Lloyd. You see, evidence that Aaron was at the scene is not enough to prove, nor does it say that he murdered Odin, that he intended Odin to be killed, that he planned for Odin to be killed, or instructed others to kill him. Mere presence is not enough. In our system, we cannot be convicted of a crime just because we hang with the wrong people or we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez did not murder Odin Lloyd. Now they're going to start their evidence. They get to go first. That's the way it is. They have the burden of proof, as Judge Garsh has instructed you. I would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, to listen very carefully to the questions they ask the witnesses. Listen very carefully to the answers those witnesses give. Listen to what those witnesses say and don't say. We'll have a chance to ask them questions. Listen to what they say in response to our questions. You see, ladies and gentlemen, our job all sides. Let me give you an example. This is my late grandfather's pocket watch. It's not worth much, but it still keeps time. Do you see it? Do you see my grandfather's watch? You really don't. You've not seen it until you've turned it over and looked at his initials carved in the back. You've not seen it unless you look at the engraving on the side. You've not seen it unless you've wound the stem. You see, ladies and gentlemen, you don't see evidence until you've looked at it from all sides. Beware of those who show you only one side. We will bring out the other side. We will encourage you to look at the evidence. We will encourage you to question the evidence. We will ask you to think about witnesses when they finish testifying. Think about what they said. Ask yourself, does it make sense? Does what I heard fit? Does this make sense? You see, ladies and gentlemen, that's why we have a jury. That's why we brought you here. That's why we need you here. Ladies and gentlemen, in June of 2013, Aaron Hernandez was planning a future, not a murder. The time when all that mattered was what the police and prosecutors believed to be true or imagined to be true is over. Now it's your turn. Now it's your time. It's your view that matters. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the highest degree of confidence that when you look at all the evidence, when you evaluate it from all sides, when you hold off judgment and put it all together at the end, you will conclude that the evidence shows that Aaron Hernandez did not murder his friend Odin Lloyd. Aaron Hernandez is not guilty.
Thank you. Since there's been some reference in the openings to some legal principles, let me just instruct you that the Commonwealth is not required to prove that the defendant himself perform the act that caused Odin Lloyd's death. However, to establish that a defendant is guilty of murder, the Commonwealth must prove two things beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant knowingly participated in the commission of that crime. And second, the Commonwealth must prove that he did so with the intent required to commit the crime. At the end of the case, I will be giving you detailed instructions on further on these principles as well as other principles. At this time, we're going to take a lunch recess for an hour. We'll resume in an hour. Thank you. Keep your mind suspended. Don't discuss the case among yourselves or with anyone else.